I want to just say welcome again to the President Biden's New Directions for Government Contracting webinar, and I'll hand things over to our excellent presenters here. So thank you so much, guys. Take it away.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to add our welcome to that. If you can go to the first substantive slide, James, I'd appreciate it. No, that's the presenter's bio. You can skip that. Just go right to the next. There we go. I want to emphasize that what we're going through now is, in one extent, routine. Every time we get a new president, especially if it's of a new political party, there are going to be changes. What is making this one especially hectic is the pandemic that we're all hopefully recovering from. And secondly, the record, the unprecedented pace of the executive orders, presidential proclamations that are being issued now. That's making this especially hectic in terms of keeping up to date. Now, we're going to break our talk into the two major categories of changes: more money and projects. It sounds antiquated now to be talking about tens of billions of dollars. Now they're throwing about trillions. A few months ago, we were wondering whether or not there would be a retreat from the traditional $500 billion plus a year that the federal government spends on contracting. Well, there's no danger about that at all. We're talking trillions now, for the extra purpose of reviving the economy. All that avalanche of money is going to drive some changes. Those changes will be in grants and flow down clauses, and certainly changes in the direct contracting with the prime or the general contractor. Most of the changes that are going to be implemented via regulation into the federal acquisition regulation will be in parts 19 through 25, the socioeconomic areas of the FAR. Okay, next slide, please. One of the main areas that President Biden has said he would be involved with is infrastructure. Okay, now he's talking trillions of dollars. No, not already done, but coming. Now, this is not your parents' infrastructure. Okay? We used to think of infrastructure as roads, bridges, a few dams. Now it's all of that, aviation, airports, waterfronts, dams, levees, clean air, clean water. A lot of school construction has already been passed through Congress, and everything connected to the grid. Broadband facilities, things like that. So it's gotten to be pretty much anything you can think of. Well, I shouldn't say that. One thing it's not going to include is the border wall. President Biden issued a proclamation where he stopped. The word he used was paused. Now, as you may know, that's not a technical term in government contracting. So they were paused. They have not yet been terminated for convenience yet, but so they're paused. The contracting officers issued suspension orders under the suspension of work clause. So the federal government is actually incurring about $6 million in delay costs every day because of that. And at some point, they're going to have to decide what they're going to do, because as you may know, under the suspension clause, most of that is not bearing profit. But if it is determined to be an unreasonable delay, then profit kicks in. Okay. Now, so this infrastructure, they're going to look for ways: clean energy, clean water, renewable energy. And those are going to be bywords that we're going to see a lot in the new administration. Next slide, please. Now, I think Howard is going to address this.
Well, Jim has talked about how this is historic. I mean, we're on the level really of the Cold War, World War II, and the amounts of money that are being spent. The president actually was able to sign, and it's now law, as everyone knows, the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan to combat the effects of COVID-19. And just to put in perspective the enormity of 1.9 trillion, back with the Great Recession, when the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was passed. I think we all remember that dark time. That act was $800 million. So the 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan is more than twice that amount. And it includes 130 billion for various procurements, construction, classrooms, ventilation systems, protective gear, and other improvements for K through 12 schools, 130 billion. When we throw out 130, we're not talking hundreds of millions, we're talking billions. It's a tremendous amount of money. But then in the next breath, we say, and 350 billion for state and local governments, and that includes tribal governments as well. And again, that is money that before, when we first were giving this talk, it was money that was proposed, but now it's, in March, it was finally approved by Congress along party line votes, and it's now it's now a reality. And the next part of that is the Build Back Better plan, which is to be detailed in the President's State of the Union address. Now, that was going to be on February 23rd of 2021, but it's been pushed back, and actually it's expected that Thursday of this week that the president's going to give his President Biden is going to give his first press conference, and in that press conference he's going to detail the exact portions of the Build Back America plan. And it was leaked, as these things are, yesterday in the New York Times, that the president's being briefed by his folks that he's looking at $3 trillion. 1.3 trillion has always been talked about for infrastructure. That is tremendous amount of money. And this is in addition to the 1.9 trillion. In the first year, what President Biden has said is he's jump-starting highways and bridges by 50 billion just for highway and bridges. Now, again, it was passed along party lines, and the House and Senate are closely divided, but the Democrats have the edge right now. But Senator Mitch McConnell, who's now in the loyal opposition, stated after the announcement of the $3 trillion yesterday for Build Back America that he thought it would be a quote unquote Trojan horse for massive tax hikes. So there still is going to be discussion and everything has to be worked out. But the thing about it is that the 1.9 trillion, it happened. And the Build Back America plan, it's going to be introduced. 1.3 trillion, you're talking, as Jim mentioned, highways, bridges, broadband for rural areas. One part of the 1.9 trillion that's critical is the amounts that were earmarked for small business. And you're looking at 15 billion that have been approved, it's passed, in grants for small businesses, 35 billion in financing for small businesses. And to leverage, the administration is looking to leverage that financing to 175 billion by partnering with financial institutions. So it really is something, along the magnitude of the Cold War, World War II, the great projects that America has entered into. And the first stage of it, 1.9 trillion, was passed very quickly when you consider that President Biden was only sworn in towards the end of January. Next slide. Now, as a part of the Build Back Better plan for America, you're also looking at research and development funding. Again, I mentioned the Cold War, World War II, on a scale well beyond the Apollo program. And, 300 billion in investment in research and development. We're talking green vehicles, as President Biden has said, is that he's going to divest the US government of gasoline vehicles and go to all electric, and he means what he says. He's doing it. And some might ask, well, what's driving this? And this goes beyond COVID. What's driving this is competition. For Apollo, it was the space race with the Russians, and certainly we're in competition, as we'll talk a little bit later, with the Russians when it comes to cyber. But with China, the Biden administration, their estimates are that China overtook the United States in research and development spending in 2020. Now, in 2020, we spent about 0.7% of the gross domestic product on research and development. Back in 1964, when the Apollo program was underway, it was 2%. So we're spending $250 billion less annually on research and development. And now that we're going to spend $3 trillion, is what was announced yesterday, on building back America, well, billions are going to go into research and development. And what they're doing is they're channeling the Apollo program. I mean, we've done this once, we're going to do it again. We're going to innovate in America with the most cutting edge technologies, such as artificial intelligence and telecommunications. As far as how are we going to fund small businesses so that they can get this money? I mean, show me the money, which is always very important. We can talk and we can talk, but it's money that does make things possible. What they're looking to do in the Biden administration is a scaled up version of the Small Business Innovation Research Program and / STTR when you're talking about universities. And it's to supersize that. And, again, people might say, well, approval, Howard, it's going to be an issue as to whether they can get this money. And all I can say is that that 1.9 trillion, that got passed, and it got passed quickly. So it proves that President Biden can pass. I won't get into the nitty gritty of this, but as most of you, experts out there who read who keep up with this, President Biden used the reconciliation process. In other words, he didn't have to get the 60 votes that he would need if he hadn't used reconciliation. And, he's not going to be able, there's a limit on how many laws can be passed with reconciliation. So there's going to have to be some, I think, broader support in the loyal opposition, the Republican Party, to some of this spending. But it has, he has been able to make it work. Part of this research and development, as small businesses get involved, is to understand that intellectual property in government contracting, it's a lot different than in the civilian sector, and that there are two sets of rules, one for civilian agencies and one for the Department of Defense. I mean, and basically, the rules now are that you as a small business will always maintain ownership of your technical data and rights in software that's non-commercial. However, the government gets a license. And what the government has done recently, which you need to be aware of as you're getting into this, is there are DFARS revisions which are supposed to come out very soon. And the whole purpose is to shift the intellectual property rights away from the current standards, where you keep ownership as a small business and the government just gets a license, to more individualized ownership and license rights that are more favorable to the government and less favorable to contractors. So you've really got to be aware of this as you look at opportunities with this research and development contracting. But as the economy has had issues, the big point is that the government is the big game in town. Next slide, please. And with this, I hand you back to Jim's capable hands.
Okay, well, as Howard has mentioned, there are going to be some problems on the future in the future. The 1.9 trillion passed because everyone recognized we've got to do something with this pandemic. But there's going to be a lot of people in Congress who are going to choke on the numbers that we're talking about, and not just Republicans. There are already a lot of fiscally conservative Democrats who are saying, wait a minute, our tax revenues are going to be down and our spending is just skyrocketed here. So it's great to plan for these trillions, but there will have to be some scaling back of that. Next slide, please, James. Now, there are going to be different categories of the changes. First, there will be a continuation of some Trump policies. Perhaps with a new emphasis. I want to emphasize that. A lot of times when a new administration comes in, you get the impression that they're coming in with a clean sweep. The broom is going to sweep everything out. Oh, there are a lot of things that have already been started and been continued. So that will happen. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Sometimes there will be an absolute U-turn from President Trump's policy. Some things were changed within hours. For example, Executive Order 14006, President Trump had prisons run by private concerns. I think on his first day of office, President Biden issued that executive order. That's done for. So those of you who might be familiar with the old A76 program, where work that had been done by a federal workforce was competed and a contractor might win it. Well, I don't think that's going to happen anytime in this administration. There has been an absolutely aggressive use of the executive order. Over 30 were issued in President Biden's first 19 days. The two we mentioned there, the Made in All of America, that is the continuation of Buy American, and then the executive order on a sustainable public health supply chain. We'll talk more about that really on our last slide. But if you look there at the bottom, those are the things that are either re-emphasized or they're brand new. Certainly the COVID-19 vaccine distribution has gotten a great deal of play in this, but we're going to talk about really all of these things. Next slide, please, James. Now, some of the Trump policies that are likely to stay. Now, this is not the only one, but remember President Trump basically replaced NAFTA with the U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement. That's probably going to stay because it passed with such bipartisan support. So that looks pretty secure. The opportunity zones, if you remember in the 2017 tax legislation, they created something where if businesses invest in inner cities, they got very favorable tax treatment. So that has worked out so well, and both parties acknowledge that will certainly continue. Now, I want to spend a little time on that last bullet there, the Defense Production Act, DPA, which you saw on the previous slide. If you're not familiar with that, the Defense Production Act of 1950, it came out at the start of the Korean War, it allows the federal government to act as a traffic cop. So that if you were a steel mill and you had all of your regular supply customers, General Motors, Chrysler, what have you, this act allowed the federal government to say, well, wait a minute, this is a tank contractor. We need those tanks. This act, we order you now under this act to let that tank contractor cut to the head of the line and get the steel before even your long-term customers who are earlier in the line. President Trump used this quite a lot in his administration for a variety of things, but especially in 2020 to get the vaccine going in Operation Warp Speed. President Biden has already used it to facilitate and hasten the distribution of the vaccine. So if you've ever been involved in one of these, it's a bit shocking because it basically says you have to let governmental contractors, and they'll be rated to cut to the head of the line, and they insulate you from liability so that your customers who are now getting delayed deliveries don't have a right to sue you for that. Okay, so those policies are definitely going to stay. Next slide, please, James. Now, as you all probably know, when a new president comes in, the prior president's executive orders are not automatically revoked. Okay? For example, the executive order that we still operate for equal employment is one issued by President Lyndon Johnson. Now, President Trump had, in fact, kept some of President Obama's executive orders, the one on minimum wage and on sick leave. Those are still in Part 22. But he did revoke some. Now, there are a couple that I want to point out to you that are very likely to return under a Biden administration. That right of first refusal for service employees. If you remember, President Clinton brought that in. President Bush revoked it within 3 weeks of taking office. President Obama reinstated it basically within 3 weeks of taking office. And then President Trump eventually revoked it. It will undoubtedly come back at some point in the Biden administration. Now, the previous executive orders were limited to certain types of service contracts. But in those types of service contracts, if the new contractor, the replacement contractor, wants to hire new workers, he had to make the first offer, the right of first refusal to the previous contractor's employees. Okay, so that will undoubtedly come back. Now, that one there on the bottom, the Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces Act. This was one that President Obama issued in 2016. It never went into effect. The day before it was supposed to start to be phased in, a federal judge in Texas enjoined it. Then when President Trump is inaugurated, he and Congress did away with it. But it had three things. First, it required more transparency on pay, so that when a worker received his paycheck or her paycheck, basically what happened, what they had to say is the number of hours worked, the rate of pay, overtime worked, gross pay, all the deductions, and whether the individual was an employee or an independent contractor. Okay, that was the first thing. Second thing, a contractor, a federal contractor, when they proposed on a federal job, had to list all the times they had been alleged, not merely found, and that was a problem with the federal judge, alleged to have violated Davis-Bacon Act, Service Contract Act, Walsh-Healy Act, sexual harassment or something like that. And the judge said, no, you shouldn't have to admit that just on the allegation. If it's been proven, that's one thing. And then the third thing that was in there, as many of you know, when you go to work for a contractor, very often in the employment contract, that you have to agree that if you want to litigate an allegation of sexual harassment, they would require you to have it arbitrated rather than go to court. Now, so the Obama executive order had prohibited such sexual harassment arbitration clauses for federal contractors. That has not taken effect. It almost certainly will come back in some form, perhaps with slight changes under the Biden administration. Next slide, please. Now, some of the small business things. Now, Howard has already talked about this. There are so many things, little nuggets coming out for small businesses. You have to look at every act passed and all the proposals. The $400 billion small business, that deals with contracting. But there's another 100 billion proposed to go in grants to the states for lending to small businesses. There's another 28 billion going to the states earmarked for restaurants, which are virtually always small businesses that have been hammered by the pandemic. There's another 100 million, which seems so small now with the type of numbers we've been talking about, to provide more training and innovation to small business. The administration's goal is to triple the federal government contracting goal for small disadvantaged business. It's 5% basically now. By 2025, triple that to 15%. Okay. Now, the Biden administration has promised more audits to make sure that people aren't improperly alleging that they're a small business or that they're a woman-owned small business. So they're going to push for that, but there's going to be a problem just in terms of how many personnel the government can hire to do all that. The Biden administration has also promised more restraints on bundled contracts. Now, I've put the cite from the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Now, the federal government, it bundles a lot of contracts. By that, I mean it takes maybe 10 or 15 smaller contracts that had been earmarked for small businesses, but then the federal government has to award and administer 10 or 15 different small business contracts. So they would bundle them together into one large contract, which might be above the capacity of any small business to handle. So they put constraints on that in the far site there. The Biden administration has promised more of those. What I do not see is any changes to the Trump administration small business rules that came out in 2020, such as those that cut down on self-certification for women-owned business, updating the inflation amounts to qualify for a small disadvantaged business. I don't see any talk about those changing in the near future, at least. Okay. Next slide, please. Now, Part 22 deals with labor in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Now, that first bullet there, as you may remember, President Trump had issued that executive order combating race and sexual stereotyping. It was aimed at essentially the critical race theory, which the Trump administration thought was scapegoating white people. There's no other way around it. There was not an issue of whether this was going to be revoked under the Biden administration. The only issue was would it be days or hours? It turned out it was hours. On January 20th, President Biden revoked that, and he's come out with new executive orders, more than just one, mandating racial equity and basically making sure that people are not discriminated against on basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Okay, so that is the rule now. Third bullet deals with OFCCP, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Program. They are going to have a larger and more active role in a Biden administration. The new administrator, Ms. Yang, I think it's Ms. Yang, Jesse Yang, has always been a big advocate of pay equity. Her primary focus, but not exclusive focus, is on payment on wages between men and women. So if you're a contractor, you may have to be prepared to explain, well, the reason why this woman is getting paid less than this man is because of seniority, extra duties, what have you or so. Also, the Trump administration had some exemptions for religious organizations who didn't want to perform abortions, who didn't want to recognize gay marriage. Those are likely to be revoked fairly quickly, I would say within this year. Now, that fourth bullet, it deals with the $15 minimum wage. Now, I want to emphasize You may have seen some articles in the paper that the Congressional Budget Office was talking about, well, you know, if you come out with a nationwide, not just federal contractor, nationwide minimum wage of $15 an hour, that will raise something like 900,000 people out of poverty, but there will be a loss of 1.4 million jobs, and it will be highly inflationary. So Congress was kind of balking about that. That's not what that fourth bullet is about. The fourth bullet is not dealing with everybody's minimum wage raising in the country. It's just focused on federal contractors. Now, President Biden has promised such an executive order within 100 days of his inauguration. So, you know, be aware of that. I haven't seen anything indicating that that's not coming. Okay. Now, down there, and I should mention, you all know this, Democratic administrations are much more favorable to unions than Republican administration. Okay. Project labor agreements, where before the federal government starts a major project, a major construction project, the federal government will enter into agreements with the local labor unions, labor organizations for the terms and conditions of employment. That's covered under FAR subpart 22.5. That will undoubtedly, their use will undoubtedly increase during a Biden administration. Okay. Next slide, please, James. I've already mentioned that the Democrats have proposed a Protect the Right to Organize Act. This is a very, very pro-labor right. So it's just proposed now. Senator Patty Murray has proposed it among others, but I just want to point that out to you that that is in the hopper. Whether it passes or not, we don't know. But take a look at that last bullet. Undeniably, it will be easier for non-U.S. citizens to be legally employed now under a Biden administration. That is especially important, as you can see there from the quote from the Associated General Contractors, in the construction industry, but certainly not just in the construction industry. A lot of service industries will really appreciate that. So there are those major changes coming in labor standards. Next slide, please, James. Now, Environment, Energy, Safety, Part 23. The Biden administration, you've already seen that. It's more economically sensitive and aggressive. Remember, we talked about infrastructure, clean air, clean water. All of that is going to be in there. Howard mentioned there's about 600,000 federal gas-driven vehicles. President Biden has already promised we're going to phase those out. And I want to emphasize the word phase. Obviously, you can't go out and just buy 600,000 cars when you've got a whole bunch of cars in the inventory that are perfectly usable. So they are going to be phased out over time. The Keystone Pipeline has already been stopped. There's a great deal of furor over that, but it's been stopped. Now, that second bullet, I want to emphasize this. We saw the tepid steps on this in the Biden administration. The Obama administration, excuse me, but it is certainly coming back now. You're all familiar with when you deal with the federal contract, when you propose, you will be evaluated on your technical merit, past performance, management, price, things like that. It is highly likely that during the Biden administration, there'll be another category. What's the size of your carbon footprint? Not just how well you are going to perform this contract and whether you'll be environmentally sensitive on this contract, but are you a good steward for the planet? Okay. So you may have to be prepared if you're a contractor to come in and say, wait a minute, this is my carbon footprint. This is how we have reduced our impact on the environment. Okay? Now that last bullet, protecting the federal workforce and requiring mask wearing, that was issued. That is what causes, if you do work on federal property or in a federal building, that you have to maintain social distancing and wear a mask. It would not surprise me at all. In fact, I would expect this, that before the year is out, you contractors, if you are going to be doing work on federal land or in federal facilities, that you will have to certify that your workforce has been vaccinated, okay? Now, that might be via a change order by the contracting officer, or it might be a change by the installation commander, the site manager for DOE or VA, or the GSA building manager that, no, you will not be allowed into this building. So be aware of that. You know, keep track of your employees and their vaccination status. Okay? Next slide, please. The Buy America Act. Okay, Buy America, Buy American. I'll just use those phrases interchangeably. President Trump had been extremely active. I mean, probably the most active president on that since Eisenhower. He issued 3 executive orders on that. His last was implemented fairly recently into the federal acquisition regulation. He cut back on waivers, increased the thresholds. President Biden has indicated clearly that he is going to continue that. He's already issued that one executive order, 14005, ensuring the Made in America, made in all of America by all of America's workers. What is happening? And you have to understand this. Remember World War II. We were the arsenal of democracy. We just built more tanks, battleships, planes. We could not replicate that today. So both the Trump administration and the Biden administration are hell-bent for leather for making that clear, okay? So Howard and I have talked about this very often. Prior to the last few years, it was very easy to get waivers for well, we don't want to use American products. We're going to use a German product, or we're going to use a Chinese product. Boy, it's hard to get a waiver now, much harder. There is a much higher level approval, and there is a website. There will be a website where that agencies will post on the website, okay, we are considering granting a waiver for this product because we don't think we can get it at a reasonable price here in the United States. So that somebody from Scranton, Pennsylvania can look at that and then write in and say, wait a minute, I build that. I can sell that to you at a reasonable price. There is no reason for you to grant a waiver from the Buy American Act on that, okay? Also, as you may remember, old rule, if you had 50.1% of the material that go into that component, it was a domestic component, okay? You could just squeak by. No longer. Now, if it's non-commercial off the shelf, it's got to be 55%. But if it's iron and steel, 95%, okay? The iron and steel industry in this country has taken a beating. Okay, so both the present administration and the former administration were hell-bent on leather. Now we've got to build them back up. Now, President Trump had issued a lot of tariffs. I doubt if they'll continue in the Biden administration, but that was the purpose of that, to build up the iron and steel production capability here in the United States. Okay, next slide, and I'll turn it back to Howard. Howard, yeah, you're mute.
Some people would prefer if I was mute. But Jim talked about, the continuity in some Trump policies, and certainly when it comes to Made in All America executive order that was issued by President Biden, he's just essentially amplifying and continuing the processes that President Trump also had. And again, Jim said, President Trump was the most active since Eisenhower, and it looks to me like President Biden is going to be just as active as President Trump. And you may ask yourself, well, what does this really mean to me, Howard, this new, executive order? And I think one of the biggest things is for your supply chains is it have a dramatic impact in that what we've always had before is a domestic content test, and it's currently in, as we all know, in FAR Part 25, which is used to identify the domestic content, and it used a test dealing with content. And what President Biden has done is to change that to a value-added approach. In essence, we're going to look at the value added to the product through US-based production or US job supporting economic activity. Now, Jim mentioned that President Trump's executive order dealing with, buy America, buy American domestic preferences. The final rule just came out, very recently. It was in January, and it became effective in February. So it took about a year and a half to get to the final rule, which fleshed out what was in his EO. Well, we're going to have to wait, probably a year to figure out what this US-based production or US job supporting economic activity means. But it's a real change from domestic content. It's a real change. The other change is a likely increase to the percentage added to a foreign bid to determine whether a domestic bid is reasonable. Now, again, President Trump's executive order raised that to 20% and 30% respectively for large and small businesses as far as what you would add under his final rule. Now, it looks like President Biden will raise those even further. As we all know, the Department of Defense, their percentage is 50%, which is quite high. May it go to 50% for non-DoD? Well, that remains to be seen, but I really do think it's going to be increased from the 20 and 30% that President Trump boosted it. I mean, prior to President Trump, it was 6% and 12%. So these are dramatic rises. So as Jim mentioned, and I like his term, we were the arsenal of democracy, and that it would be we couldn't replicate that now, and that really is the practical problem to overcome: cost and lack of an adequate domestic supply chain. But I would say over the 4 years of the Trump administration, the supply chain became a lot more robust. But I mean, one example that's sort of near and dear to me, because I love the maritime industry, was the merchant vessel Tustamina, which is a passenger ferry that has sleeping compartments like a cruise ship in Alaska that goes out to the Aleutian Islands and into the deep sea. It's over 45 years old, and it needed to be replaced. Well, in the when Trump was elected, the state of Alaska, using funds from under the Buy America Act, using a grant of millions and millions of dollars, asked for over 900 exemptions to the Buy America Act. And in the past, they had been readily approved. Well, the Trump administration denied all the requests, and the state, over a 2-year period, was able to find hundreds of suppliers and started up with hundreds of suppliers. And so they came back and said, well, now we only need 54 waivers of the Buy America Act, and the Federal Highway Administration still said no. Then, of course, the issue became the state of Alaska didn't have the money, because while they have the grant, they still have to fund a certain amount, and the cost went up dramatically because they couldn't use items that weren't meeting the Buy America standard for the use of U.S. iron and steel. How are we going to overcome that? Well, the executive order, President Biden has that. Well, I've got an answer. And that answer is the Holland's Manufacturing Extension Partnership, which I had never heard of, but it's active in all 50 states. And it's funded by the US government. And under the executive order, it's being supersized. And basically, that organization, it's a public-private partnership, sort of like, you know, in some ways, which you find with PTAC, where there's lots of funding sources, not just the federal government that keeps it going. And they go out and they search for buying offices for American products in the supply chain. And so you're going to see under this EO a link up with this Holland's manufacturing extension program. And you know, the Biden administration is very high on this initiative, and that it will help to find, you know, additional domestic supply. Also, I would say, just in my experience over the last 4 years, I have seen companies start up to make domestically different parts and engines and whatnot that previously were only produced overseas, so that they could supply grantees who are building roads, bridges, and ferries, like in Alaska. Another part of this office is the Made in America office, which is going to be an OMB, and there are going to be, essentially, for waivers, not only this website that Jim talked about, but also this new office that will have to approve waivers, and if they disapprove a waiver, will issue a written decision. Now, we all know the Federal Highway Administration, before they would grant a waiver, they would right now publish it on the internet, and the Federal Aviation Administration, before they would issue a waiver, would publish it in the Federal Register. But what President Biden is talking about is something much, much bigger. I mean, think 50 times bigger, because there are dozens of domestic preference requirements out there that exemptions and waivers are granted besides the Buy America or Buy American. And so this is a sea change. Also, with agency reporting requirements, President Trump, with his enforcement of Buy America and Buy American, he didn't really change a lot of rules during his 4 years. But what he did was he enforced things. And the only way you can enforce things is to know what's going on out there in the government. And so he had a census, sort of like, you know, in biblical times, where everyone had to go and to their home city and get registered. Well, all the agencies had to register what they were doing with the Trump administration, and Biden follows this up. Within 180 days under this order, there's going to be a reporting on the use of waivers: who, what, when, where, and how. You got to report it. And then you're going to have to report it twice a year. So it's going to become a part of those agencies' procurement acquisition planning, you know, which, as you all know, is a part of the FAR, but it's going to be something that everyone's going to have to be working on throughout the year. The final rule that's going to come from this EO is going to definitely lead to more enforcement. Whenever you have changes that increase standards, there's a likely increase in fraud risk and in enforcement. And that's just because things are tougher. Trump changed it to 20%, 30%, from 6% and 12%. President Biden's order looks to make that even greater. The domestic content, if they change that measure, I mean, it's still difficult to figure out domestic content, and we've been dealing with it for, you know, decades. And now to go to a whole new value-added concept, it's going to, you know, take us a while to, you know, to get up to speed, and we're going to need the final rule that's coming. President Biden is going beyond Buy America and Buy American, though. There are other domestic content rules that are out there. And for instance, in this EO, he reaffirmed the Jones Act. That, you know, and the Jones Act says that all vessels that go from one US port to another have to be built in the US. And also that it also deals with not only the crewing of the ships, but construction of vessels like offshore wind is a part, it's huge. What this does is these ships that are now going to have to go out to these wind farms, and the wind farms are already out there, have to be built in the US. In fact, the first US flag vessel was just delivered. And there was a question as to whether or not, you could go on and buy one of these vessels in Korea or Germany. And President Biden, in the executive order, he did something that President Trump, didn't do, and that was explicitly affirm his support for the Jones Act. And he's doing that because this is a cornerstone to organized labor in America and the maritime industry. Next slide, please, James. Cybersecurity and the supply chain. Well, it's not on this slide, but on February 24th, President Biden issued a new executive order dealing with a review of the critical supply chain in semiconductor, high capacity batteries, critical minerals, including what are known as rare earth elements. That's especially used with batteries. Pharmaceuticals, we're in the age of COVID-19, and we want to make sure that we have the active pharmaceutical ingredients so that we don't have to rely on China. Or when we're dealing with cybersecurity, our competition is not only with China, but with Russia, as I'll talk about in a moment. So the first thing is what everyone has to be aware of: CMMC. Whether you're the smallest subcontractor or the biggest major defense contractor like a Lockheed Martin or a Boeing, the Department of Defense's interim final rule for what they call the Cybersecurity Maturity Model, CMMC, went into effect November 30th, 2020. And you've got to register and you've got to report assessment scores in accordance with that DoD assessment methodology in the Supplier Performance Risk System. And this is a database that, it's required of all DoD contractors and subcontractors that handle what's known as CUI, which is Controlled Unclassified Information. And there's a subset, which is, CDI, Controlled Defense Information. Many times, I'm getting, the question, everyone's trying to figure out, well, what is CUI? Well, I'll just tell you, it's anything that you're handling from the government that you wouldn't publish, on Facebook. So it's pretty much everything that you're dealing with. I typically tell clients when they're starting out, especially subcontractors under a prime contract, ask your prime, okay, I know I've got to do this. It's been flowed down to me to have this CMMC compliance, but what is the CUI I'm going to get? I mean, tell me what I'm to look for. Just as a beginning question, because otherwise, as you get into contract performance, you're going to ask that question, and sometimes it's a little bit late, especially if you have a breach. The Russians. So, as we all know, the Russians infiltrated the Democratic National Committee, and of course, they couldn't figure out. They were trying to figure out who did it. And the two code names, everyone knew the code names. It was, Fuzzy Bear and Cozy Bear. After consultants were hired by the Democratic National Committee, after a multi-million-dollar investigation by Mr. Mueller, it was the Russians. Now, of course, the Russians have always gone by Bear as sort of their mascot for years. Well, SolarWinds, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you can go and you can read their memo. It's on their letterhead. It's on the internet. Just search it. And they say the Russian government infiltrated the SolarWinds Orion product, which is to keep your computer system safe. And that's used by most government agencies and industry. And what they did with this worm was to get into a backdoor look into all of the government's IT systems. This worm, and it also was for, many, Lockheed Martin, many defense contractors. And so this, this is our competitor. This is the Russians, and CMMC really wouldn't have made a difference, I don't think, in SolarWinds. But it's leading to a number of legislative changes that are impacting cyber security for the government, for contractors, enforcement, and sanctions. And then our other competitor, the Chinese, there's going to be more rigorous scrutiny of software and cloud-based offerings that are sold to the government. And now, as far as the Chinese are concerned, I mean, Section 889, basically said if you're using, IT from these 5 Chinese companies, you, defense contractor, have to rip that out. What we're focusing on really, though, is the final rule to that. I mean, what it says, not only those 5 Chinese companies, but any of their subsidiaries or affiliates. And so we're all looking for, just like we looked for the final rule on the Buy American provisions that Donald Trump had, and now we'll look for the final rule on what President Biden had. We're looking to see what other Chinese companies are involved, because you're certifying, if you're going to get a defense contract, and this is flowed down to subcontractors, that you're not using this covered technology from these 5 companies. And the equipment is surveillance. We're talking video cameras. So the other big question is, well, lots of small businesses have video cameras. Are these the cameras that they're using for public security and critical infrastructure? The final rule, which should come out very soon, is going to answer this. We also have the Federal Acquisition Security Council, which basically is tasked with coming up with new rules like Section 889. And again, Section 889 said, these Chinese companies can't use them anymore. If you're using their servers, if you're using their cameras, and you get a government contract, you've got to certify that you're not using that equipment, which means you got to rip it out. It's very expensive. And we're also waiting on the final rule. What does that use mean? If you read Section 889, it's not just use on your government contracts, but it's use on your civilian contracts also. The Federal Acquisition Security Council, their mandate is to go and look at other sectors. And if that council feels that the supply chain there should exclude certain manufacturers, and let's face it, we're talking about the Chinese, and if the Russian government has put a worm into the software product that the government uses for our security of our systems, then they're going to be looking at the Russians also, and then that council can then promulgate rules to prohibit those companies from those countries from being in the U.S. government supply chain. So, Jim and I are just reading the tea leaves, and we can't say for sure what's going to happen, but the rubber is meeting the road. Money is being appropriated. The train is moving forward under this, the 2 rubrics that Jim talked about from the beginning, especially focusing on money. So that's all I have. Jim, do you have anything that you want to add?
No, Howard, I think we'll just leave it to questions.
All right. Thank you guys so much for that presentation. That was really informative. I found that really interesting. So we do have time for Q&A, but first I just want to talk about a couple upcoming events. Just a quick note, he mentioned CMMC and cybersecurity. We do have a webinar on that you can find on our past webinars page, where this webinar, the recording, as well as the PDF of all the slides will also be posted. So that it is norcalptac.org/webinar. You can find that on our webpage. So yeah, one more reminder, everyone will be getting these materials later today, so don't worry about that. On Thursday, April 8th, we've got a webinar on contracting opportunities with Marin Transit. We're partnering with the Marin Transit Agency with this. We've got how to do business with the state of California, as well as I'm certified now what. These are both webinars that we're doing in partnership with the California DGS. So please do check those out on April 13th and 14th. They do a nice 1-2 punch there. And then coming up in April, we've got a public works series. So if you work in construction, doing public works, this is a must see for you, especially if you're in our service area in Northern California. So we're always keeping this calendar updated. This is just the tip of the iceberg of what we have. So please do check out our upcoming events. All right, we've got some time for questions now. And it looks like we have a couple questions people have entered as we go along. If you have any questions, just enter them into the Q&A. I'll read them aloud if we have time to get to it. So I will start here from Lark Hilliard. I own a WOSB architecture firm. Many of my competitors are using offshore architectural drafters. They constantly undercut my prices. Will the Buy America prevent this?
Okay, why don't I take the first stab at that? Unfortunately, you've hit a loophole in the Buy American Act. The Buy American Act came out in March of 1933 when it was a manufacturing country. So if you look at FAR Part 25, which implements the domestic preference rules, they really talk about stuff, supplies and construction. They use the word services a couple of times in there, but that's really dealing with stuff. I mean, plating stuff, grinding stuff. So the area you talk about, drafting, is not specifically covered by the Buy American Act. And I don't know why. I mean, the federal government in its contracting since FY90 has spent more money on services than supplies, but they haven't caught that up yet. I would hope that there would be a legislative fix to that to expand the Buy American Act to cover pure services. Now, even if the Buy American Act doesn't cover it, I was able to successfully use one time for a client dealing with the energy department, where some work was going to be done overseas, and it was a receptive audience to the energy department. No, that's a security problem. Okay, this stuff should not be outside the United States. But a long-winded, probably unfavorable answer to your question, but no, I don't think the Buy American Act, as presently constituted, will help you on that. Howard, do you have anything you want to add on that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's a loophole in that the regulations just haven't caught up to the way people are doing business, which now with COVID, I mean, people are working from everywhere. And it's something that at least needs to be, considered.
Okay. Also, if it's a DoD program, you may be able to get the DoD has a balance of payments program, so they have problems with if the money is going overseas. But it sounded like from that individual's question that the prime contractor might be a domestic company, but they just farm it out. But I think possibly if you got your member of Congress involved, sending a letter to the accounting officer, that might help, but who knows? Who knows? I'm sorry, I can't give you a more favorable, incisive answer to your question.
Well, an answer is better than no answer, so thank you very much. Maria's asking, for startups developing IoT solutions, do you think that government contracting for our services across all infrastructure areas will be affected by potential new cybersecurity regulations? I've read that OMB is planning to update specific rules for federal, state, local IoT providers.
Well, Jim, please chime in. But the cybersecurity rules that are out there are that the DoD has put forward and that are being put forward in the rest of the federal government, and that OMB is looking to update, are implementing the NIST standards And I think most companies that are doing business outside the government are probably meeting most of those NIST standards with what they're already doing. You know, there is a checklist for small businesses that the DoD has. You know, it's a frequently asked questions, and if you go through all those questions and you do what DoD recommends, you'll be complying with their with DoD cybersecurity, which is right now one of the more onerous. So I think the answer to the question is yes, it will affect this new cybersecurity regulations will have an impact. However, since most of them are tied back to the NIST standards, I don't know that it's going to be all that, you know, all that difficult to comply if you already have a robust, you know, cybersecurity that any company really of any size should be, you know, small businesses included, should be considering. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Jim.
I do just a few things. First, I agree fully with what Howard said. A lot of times when you say, well, DOD is coming out with this CMMC program, a lot of people who don't deal with the Defense Department think, well, I don't have to worry about that. Take a look at it anyway. I mean, basically, it's coming. All the other agencies, commerce, energy, you know, Homeland Security, they're going to follow undoubtedly the DoD model. So take a look at it. If you look at the DoD model, it has 5 levels. Level 1, you've got to comply with 15 security requirements that most of you are probably doing. Level 2 is 65 requirements, so it goes up. But long-winded answer to the questioner, yes. You know, no matter what you do, you're going to have to be worried about cybersecurity. And I don't care if you're a shrubbery contractor, you're going to have to be worried about that to some extent. Okay, thank you.
And again, I think the way to look at it, I was at a you know, a virtual conference recently dealing with construction. In this area, it was shipbuilding, and you know what these companies like BAE and others that build these vessels has found is that their supplier, who's in a warehouse down the road, that's a 6-person operation, they have to be, you know, complying with the CMMC, the DoD the DFARS provision that requires cybersecurity, and you know it flows down that. It flows down that far. So when Jim says the shrubbery person, that's the analogous, you know, situation, the welding shop that that they farm things out to when they're building a ship.
Okay, thank you guys for that answer. An anonymous attendee is asking, would the presenters please elaborate on the points raised on the slides entitled Government Contracts R&D with a keen focus on OTA and SBIR, STTR, as well as the slide entitled Part 19, Small Business with a keen focus on the status of the administration's intent to triple business goals by 2025. So I guess they're asking you to just elaborate on those points. Would it help if I went back and found that?
Sure.
Or maybe you can just say something. It could be helpful if the questioner wanted to ask a specific question. Request to elaborate is maybe you guys can run with that. But
Jim, do you want to go, or I can start with the SBIR, whatever?
Yeah, why don't you start with the SBIR and the IP? Yeah.
Okay, there's all this money that's coming into government contracts, research and development. Okay, essentially, as I said, you know, channeling the Apollo program. So if you're a small business and you're getting into this, what the government is doing is they're using the Small Business Innovation and Research STTR program in 2 ways. Number one, to supersize it, to make it even bigger by leveraging the billions that have just been appropriated for funding. And what I was getting to really in this slide is the the IT part of that, because when you look at in other transaction agreements, they don't have to use the rights in technical data and rights in non-commercial computer software that everybody knows. For better or worse, at least it's a standard. You can read it, you can understand it, and there's a lot of precedent as to how it's been interpreted. With the other transaction agreements, the government is permitted to come up with their own data rights provisions. And in the beginning of OTAs, the government really hadn't found its sea legs yet, and they just pretty much always used the DFARS provisions or the FAR provisions. But now, as I mentioned, there are these two DFARS cases that are out there where the government is under the DFARS even looking more to get ownership and license. Well, under the other transaction agreements, they don't have to wait for the DFARS to be amended. They don't have to wait for the FAR Council. And so this money's funneling in, and it's being used now with OTAs. And now that they've got these additional billions in research and development, it's going to be funneled in there. The government's drafting their own rights and technical data and non-commercial computer software. They tend to instead of having two different provisions, they'll merge it into just one called data rights. And they're much more aggressive in taking ownership and taking rights from the get-go. And it's important, since your data rights, are sort of your company's crown jewels, that you understand. And since it can be negotiated, that you push back or you ask questions so that you know that you're protecting your rights. Now, with the Small Business Innovative Research and STTR program, it's a little bit different, because you do already have, there already is a DoD data rights clause, which merges the two normal DFARS clauses for rights and technical data and non-commercial software. And it basically is great because it allows you to keep more rights in your technical data and computer software for many more years. It's a 20-year period if it's done correctly. And so what I meant by that bullet, other transaction agreements and small business innovation research STTR program, it sort of goes with the earlier bullet on the technical data and computer software, that the government is looking to basically increase its rights and decrease your rights. And if you're a new business getting involved with SBIR and STTR, then you've got to understand that going in. Otherwise, you may find out later, gee, I gave something up. The other importance of the bullet is, again, that when you look at the money that's going into the grants and the financing, that they're looking to funnel that money into the SBIR and STTR program, giving it more money, which is good because you get more rights. You get that 20-year period. And the DFARS just came out with a new rule like 6 months ago that agrees now with the SBA's rule. Before, there was a disconnect. The SBA had a rule that was different than the DFARS, and now they're the same. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I meant by that bullet. I was dealing with the government trying to get more rights in technical data and computer software, and also the fact that the SBIR program is going to be much more important.
Okay, let me just jump in then, and because one of the questions was aimed more in my area, but let me just mention something. Howard talked about other transaction agreements. If you're not familiar with OTAs, they have been expanded, and the reason why they've come in is this is the FAR, okay? This is a monstrosity, okay? This is close to 2,000 pages. And the government discovered that a lot of times when they were buying something, it was antiquated by the time it got there. So an OTA is not bound by this, okay? They can incorporate sections of it if they want, but unless they incorporate it, the FAR doesn't apply. So if you're not familiar with OTAs, you probably will become. They've been expanded a lot in the last 2 years. DOD can do them, NASA, Energy Department, I think Homeland Security, and several other agencies. So they're coming. Now, the last part of the person's question dealt with the increase from 5% to 15% as a goal for the federal government to provide awards, contract awards to small disadvantaged businesses. Now, remember I said the goal is to do it by 2025. Now, that's 4 years. The reason for that is, there you go. James has, with great dexterity, moved that up there. So it's the second bullet. The reason why they're giving themselves 4 years to do that is you've really got to phase something like this in, because remember, this is a goal for the federal government. It may not necessarily be the goal for any particular agency. Let me take the Army, for example. Okay, if you were to say that 15% of is the goal for every command in the Army, that would be a real problem. For example, the tank and automotive command. I mean, you may not have 15% of your contractors who build tanks who are small disadvantaged businesses. So they may only have a 5% goal, where the electronics command may have a 25% goal. So that's one of the reasons for the long phase-in period, to come out with the specific goals that will enable the federal government as a whole to reach the 15% goal, but which would not be so high for some individual agencies that you were dooming them to fail simply because there is not enough of their contractor base now, or likely by 2025, that 15% of them could be consistently awarded to. So that's why that is phased in. There will certainly be a joint effort by the SBA, by the Department of Commerce, and by the other individual agencies who should know their contractor base very, very well. Okay. Now, I hope that answered your question. And back to you, James.
All right, thank you so much. That concludes our Q&A session, and that does conclude the webinar. Thanks to all of our participants who stuck around. I know we went a bit over time. When I close this webinar, you'll be directed towards a survey. It looks kind of weird. It's a Google Docs link. It's nothing nefarious. If you click on that, it just gives you an opportunity to let us know how you think we did. You can fill out anonymously, and it takes probably less than a minute. And it does matter a lot to us and to our funder, so that's also nice to have. And of course, a very hearty thanks to Howard and Jim and to everyone at Olis Morris and Rinker Baker LLP. We really appreciated this webinar and the partnership, and we look forward to future events together. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone.